Welcome back. We got something a little special for you this week. We have the axle surgeon in town, and they are going to be replacing a spindle on one of our trucks. We did a wheel seal on this truck a couple of weeks ago, and we found that the tolerances weren't quite what we wanted. So we went ahead and scheduled this guy to get in. And of course, he showed up an hour and a half early, so now I'm scrambling to try to get all this done to get this thing torn down, because I have to completely tear them. If these keys would work, it would be awesome. I have to get the thing completely tore down for him in a very short period of time. So I'm gonna have to get after it in a big way. Oh, good, fired right up. Do we have any air pressure? Of course not. All right, let's get started. There's the outer bearing. There's the cone. There it goes. And I broke my screwdriver. Nice Harbor Freight $3 screwdriver. I'll never recover from that. All right, there's the brake spider. Oh. Oh, hell yeah. Look at that. Look at that. Okay, so here's the situation. I got all that tore down. It has to be torn down completely to the bare spindle. All the brakes and everything has to be removed. Now, he's going to come in and he's going to cut that spindle off and weld a new one in its place. A lot of times, if you go to a TA or Petro and you got a leaking wheel seal, they're going to make you sign a paper that says, if we take this apart and we find a spindle out of tolerance, they will not put it back together until these guys or someone like them comes in, cuts the spindle off, and puts it back on. These wheel ends are serious business, okay? Because the only thing holding the tires, the wheels, the drum, and the axle shaft to that spindle is the nut. If that nut is not torqued properly, if the bearings are not set properly, if that wheel seal starts leaking and it gets dry, it will cut that thing off like you cut off a torch, and the whole thing will leave the chat. And now you've got probably 1,500, 2,000 pounds of mass going through somebody's windshield. So please don't mess around with these things. You have to do this right. I'm going to do a much more detailed explanation as we put it back together to show what we do and how we do it. Let's get a little bit of close-up look at that spindle. All right, so this is our outer bearing. And what we end up with, you can see some scoring there, but what we end up with is play. Like, see how it's really hard to see. It's thousandths of an inch is the tolerance. This one's way out. Okay, see how that moves? Okay, what happens is that thing starts spinning like that. Instead of being kind of tight where this part spins, you end up getting the whole thing spinning. And when you get the whole thing spinning at all those, then that begins to wear the surface even faster, right? Because your back bearing ride, your seal rides right here. And look, when you are letting one of these single-celled organisms at the truck stop do a wheel seal, make sure they clean this shit up. This needs to be cleaned up perfectly, all right? Then your rear bearing rides here, your front bearing rides here, and then our axle nut goes on here and holds the whole thing together. This right here is the cause of why this one's getting replaced. We caught it before it got too bad. Sometimes you'll see, like you'll be able to pull your finger across it so you can kind of see some there, but that thing has been spinning on there and it's just a matter of time. But this truck's got 1.3 million on it. That's probably the original Spindle. So, and I've seen them with 1.5, 1.6, 1.8, and the Spindle's perfect. It's all about proper bearing adjustment, proper torque specs, taking care of it, making sure it's not leaking and keeping it greased. All right, this is Cody of the Axle Surgeon. He was just explaining to me what he's going to do here. Why don't you tell me that again and show that to me?
So we're going to heat this up. This is a seal journal. This one is a 4.125 seal. We're going to heat it up, slide it on, put it into place, and then I'll machine the housing out to fit this. There's no threads, none of that stuff. Just a direct interference fit.
And then you cut. So are you cutting behind where the seal location?
Yes.
Where the seal rides now. So the seal's going to ride on that.
Correct.
Okay.
That's your new seal surface.
So we're cutting back here somewhere?
Yes.
Or you just have to measure it for each truck as far as?
You're basically measuring whatever you're cutting out, you're putting back. So whatever that measures out to.
Okay, so then you make the measurement, then you whack that off.
Yes, sir.
And then do those pieces weld together as a part of this? Is that like one weld that holds the three of them together?
Well, no, it'll get welded to that spindle.
Okay, you're welding that, and then you weld that onto here.
Yep, and a plug weld on the side.
Oh, right, the plug, yeah, I've seen that too. Cool, I'm really excited to see this process. I've always heard about it, but I've never actually seen it. So this is that outer bearing surface I was showing you the other one. So that means this would be the rear or inner bearing, and I guess somewhere in here will be that seal surface, which should be that right there. This is cool stuff. Out with the old and in with the new. Now we just gotta put it all back together. That thing's ready to go back together, but it is still quite warm, so I'm gonna let that cool off a little bit. Now we get this brake spider on.
Could just lock those bolts right down.
S-cam back in. We are back in the shop after the holiday, cut off a little bit early. So I went ahead and ordered a new hub for this because the hub comes with new seal, new bearings, new races and everything since we've got this new one on here. Kyle right now is making all kind of racket working on putting the new spring bushings in. Well, we had to get a little Mediva with it, but it's out. But it ain't going back in, that's for sure. That one's toast.
Pulling the bushing out.
Okay, we got all the new bushings in with new bolts. So here is the old bushing. Now this one, it's kind of hard to see. This one wasn't terrible. I mean, you can kind of see how it's flat on the bottom. But this one over here, this one was actually completely separated when we took the bolts out. This came out, this happened when we pulled it out. It kind of fused it back together. But these things were junk. So now that we have these new bushings in here and we have new torque rods, we put them on earlier. Now this truck can be properly aligned. There it goes. See, that's what it looked like when it came out. There was just nothing holding that bushing, which means there's nothing holding this axle from moving back and forth, and when the torque rods that were in it were gutted, it was moving. So when you have that much movement, you cannot do a proper alignment because it's not going to stick. So what Kyle will do is he can put shims in here that can move the axle frontwards or backwards depending on how the axle, the thrust angle needs to be set. So we got to finish a job on the turbo. We've got to put the new hub assembly on, put the brakes back on, put the wheel back on, and this one will pretty much be ready to go. And should be a much more pleasant truck to drive with a better alignment and a properly adjusted suspension.
We had Axle Surgeon come out and replace one of our spindles for us.
I'm gonna show you how to properly install a hub. So the first thing you're doing when you're replacing the hub, you have to check this seal surface, even on a brand new one. He just did a bunch of welding here. So you just want to rub your fingers across it, make sure there's no spatter from the welding, make sure there's no damage. This guy did an awesome job, so I don't feel anything. But we're pretty much ready to go. You also want to check if you have an old spindle, and this is actually the reason why we replaced it. You want to feel every surface where the seal rides. You want to check where both the bearings ride, the inner and the outer. You want to make sure the threads are good for the nut. Just give everything a once over. Make sure everything's good before you install. You want to make sure both your bearings are really well lubricated. So I'll actually just take this. Ideally, if you're just replacing the bearing or the seal or something, you could take this out and just let it sit right in a tub of oil. I don't have that option because the seal's already installed. Just get it really well lubricated. So this is called a Rev HD nut. This is our choice of outer spindle nut. We always use these. If we take something else off, this is what we're going to be putting back on. And the reason is because of how well it locks. These splines lock right into the spindle. Once you set that, you have it on there right, it's never going to loosen up. It can't. So another thing that's very important, make sure the first time you do it, you forget to put the cone in, so that way you have to take it back apart. At least I didn't torque it yet. Even if you do something like that, it's kind of stupid. That's what it is. There we go. We torque our drive axle spindle nuts to 500 pounds if they have the cone installed. Another thing you got to remember is you got to turn them while you're torquing them. I might not be able to do this by myself. I might need some help for this one. Oh, still perfectly fine. What we do is I'll set it a couple times. You never want to break something loose with a torque wrench. You could damage it, lose the calibration. So since this is all brand new, I like to set it a couple times. Probably do this about 3 times. So the next part is installing the locking feature of this. You put it right there. Sometimes you gotta tweak it a little bit. I may have to torque it up to just a hair more. Just let it move just a little bit. See, that's not quite doing it. See it? Fits nicely. That's it. This nut cannot move, ever. It cannot loosen. Still spins nice and freely. Now we're ready for the axle shaft. All right, brand new gasket. You have to make sure the surfaces are very clean. This is a brand new hub, so that's perfectly clean from stock. I cleaned that up a second ago. So something that's very important, if you ever have this hub off for any reason at all, it drains all the fluid out, or if you put a new one, obviously, like we're doing, there's a little drain plug with a 1/4 inch Allen. You have to take this out and put some fluid in it. Because if you don't, the bearings, even though we put some oil on it when we installed it, it will run the bearings dry before it has time to get all the way from the inner axle to this outer hub. It will run dry and it will absolutely destroy your hubs prematurely, your bearings. So what we do is we put about 1/2 a quart or so in here to start out. And anytime, if you are ever messing with your outer hubs, you always have to check your gear oil level on your pumpkin and make sure it's filled up. This hub's completely done. Brakes installed, the shoes are installed, ready for the breakdown. So you always want to torque your lug nuts to 450 to 500 inch-pounds. I'm going to show you the inspection process for an MD alignment. Very first thing we're going to show you is how to check the front end suspension. And then we're going to move to the rear, even though the rear has already been, we replaced the bushings, we replaced the torque rods, so that's not much to show you, but I'll still show you how to adjust it while we're doing the alignment. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to check the caster angle on the truck. This is an automatic angle finder. And what we do is we set it right there on the frame. We'll find, you want to set it to 0 on the frame, and then there's this little pad on the bottom of the axle right outside of the U-bolts. Frame here, I already zeroed that out, and then I'll take it down and I'll compare it to this, 3.6 degrees. So that's right where we want it. We want it about right between 2 to 5 degrees. As long as they're both between 2 to 5 degrees, we're happy. What we're really looking for is a difference between the two. We don't want one to be 1 degree and one to be 5 or something like that. We don't want it to be a significant difference between the two. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the steering shaft and I'm just going to shake it back and forth, turn it, make sure there's no obvious significant play in anything. While I'm doing that, I'm also going to look at the drag link, see if there's any major play that I can see while shaking that. One of the best ways we found to check for play in any of these type of joints is you take a great big pair of channel locks and you're looking for significant movement. Even brand new ones have a little bit, but you're looking for anything excessive. That has a little bit, but it's okay. That was good too. Check tie rod play with the channel lock as well. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jack up this wheel. I want it to be just barely off the ground. All right, now that the wheel's just off the ground, you want to grab your fingers here. You want to sit back and you want to take a wide base. Just rock it back and forth. Hear that clicking? Something's clearly. Another thing you want to do while you're here is take the wheel and spin it. Put your hand on the brake. You want it to be nice and smooth. If it has a lot of vibration, it's an indication of a bearing failure. So pulling onto the top of the tire, we'll check for bearing play or kingpin play. You also want to check the side of the tires. And that'll give you an indication of tie rod play. Another way we check for play is using this and a great big pry bar. Put it right down there. We'll step down on it. Something has significant play. So now that I feel that much play, I'm going to check it with a dial indicator. A good easy way to tell if it's kingpin play, if it is, you will see the brake chamber moving in and out. You can also have someone else step on the brake, and if your play goes away, you know it's wheel bearing play, because the brakes will lock it right tight and it won't allow it to move anymore. push it and hold it. All right, about 5 thousandths play. All right, let go. After doing our inspection on the front end, we realized both sides, passenger and driver, both have around 5 thousandths kingpin play. That's not terrible, but that's about as much as we'll possibly do in alignment. I believe both sides have wheel bearing play. I'll show you that in a second. This already has a Rev AC nut in it. This is loose when we checked from before. If this is loose, it's because it wasn't torqued properly when you first installed it. Definitely loose. All right. All right, now we're going to show you how to set the rear suspension on for the alignment. First thing we do is we check the offset of the axle, so we're going to show you that now. So what you want to do is you want to take a straight edge of some kind and put it at about a 45-degree angle. And then you want to find a common point on the frame. You could use the fifth wheel, that's fine, as long as you do the same on the other side. Here, I could just use right to the frame. It's right exactly at 28.5. The measurement doesn't matter. You're comparing the measurements between side to side. So this one's right at 28, which means this axle is a ½ an inch to the right. You take these torque rods, you can shim these torque rods, and you can shift the axle over.
So in order to move this a ½ an inch, we'll put shims in that torque rod to push the axle that way.
Yep, and you use half the thickness of shim, then you want to move it. So in order to shift the axle over, we have to shim this torque rod. And we're trying to move the axle a ½ an inch over. So to move it a ½ an inch, you want 1/4 inches of shim, 1/8 shims, that's the biggest we got, because it will take 1/4 inch from this side and add it to the other side. All right, so that's 28.5. Close to 28.25.
So we need to move it 1/4.
Yeah, this one's going to be moved 1/4. So this one's 1/4 to the left.
Now that he's determined what adjustments need to be made, he's going to put the shims in, then he's going to back the truck up backwards and forwards a few times to get the suspension to settle, and then he can start checking the thrust angles on the drives. All right, let's talk about what thrust angles are and what they do. So your thrust angle is basically the direction that your rear axle is pointing, okay? Now from the factory specs, either one of these axles can be pointed in either direction. MD Alignment has a very specific way of setting the thrust angles. We want the rear axle to point a little bit to the right, and we want the front axle to point a little bit to the left. What's that doing? Well, it's making the distance between these two tires smaller than the distance between these two tires. Now for a science experiment. Okay, this cup is smaller on one side than it is on the other. So if I go to roll that cup, what does it do? It wants to go left. So as you roll that, it's naturally going to go left. So by setting the thrust angles where the front axle is left and the rear axle is right, we're creating that motion to drive the truck to the left, which is going to help because the crown of the road is tilted to the right. You spend most of your time in the slow lane. So we want these rear axles pushing the truck slightly left to help ease that crown of the road so that the truck will drive straight.
Just like that.
Yep, there it went. We forgot to adjust the, it's Freightliner lean.
Yeah.
And
forgot to tighten the bolt.
we forgot to, you have to take these U-bolts loose and move the thing over. So now we're torquing everything, and it's taking 4 arms and 2 legs. Whew, that's tight. Oh gosh, that thing's making creaky noises. Oh, we're getting there. That ain't the wrench, by the way. There it goes. One more time. Torqued, 600 pound. Okay, so to illustrate the redneckery that we were just involved in, we call this the Freightliner lean. So this airbag was all leaned in like this because we had put some new U-bolts. And the driver was supposed to stop and have these retorqued. All right, so here's the situation. On a Freightliner, your axle sets on the spring. All right, if the spring set on top of the axle, this wouldn't be an issue. But if you look here, those U-bolts hold 100% of the weight of the spring and the axle. So that means that these things are going to stretch when they're new. So the natural torque of the engine and going down the road, if these things stretch and get loose, that means that this leaf spring can move. So if you see a Freightliner and the airbags are like this and like that, what has to be done is the U-bolts generally replaced. These actually came loose since we had just put them on a few months ago. But if you have the Freightliner lean of your bags, just cut your U-bolts off, get you some new ones, get you a porta power or a come along. You can come around the axle and pull that spring back out, put your new U-bolts in, torque them to 600, drive it 1,500 miles or so, 2,000 miles, then have them retorqued again, and they should stay.
All right, now that we got the rear axle centered, I'm going to show you how to set the toe and the rear axle thrust. All right, first thing you do is you set this. You're going to hook it to the back of the tire, and then just let it drain. Stop. All right, so on this side, this is the side you zero this out. So you want that dot to be right on that line. And what that does is it shoots the laser across to the other side. So we zeroed the other side, and then it's shooting the laser across here. This fat line is the 1/16 toe in. That's where we want it ideally. We're allowed 32nd of an inch either direction, but that's right where we want it, is a 1/16 of an inch. So we're probably going to adjust that a little bit. That's just about within our tolerance, but we may adjust it just so we can show you. Okay, so I got this one set on the rear drive axle. We got it pointed straight up to the front targets we set up. Every line is a 1/4 inch, so that's about exactly 3/4 of an inch. The measurement is kind of irrelevant. What matters is the difference between both sides. Almost 1.5 inches. So now we're right at 0 on the left side, about 1.5 inches on the right. So we're pointing 1.5 inches to the right now. So what we discovered, the front axle, the left-hand measurement is 3/4, and the right-hand measurement's around 1/4, between 0 and 1/4. The front axle is pointing close to 1/2 inch to the left, and that's exactly what we want. The rear axle is pointing to the right 1.5 inches, which is in the right direction, but it's too far. So we're gonna have to move it back. What we did is we're shimming this right-hand side. What that will do is it will push this axle forward. We're gonna put a shim right there, which will point it a little bit more to the left. We're only adding a 1/16 inch shim, but that's enough to move the whole, by the time it gets to the front, it's enough to move it 1 inch. Take that nut off on both sides. You don't have to take it all the way off, but you loosen it so it can turn. And this tie rod is threaded into this. Once we loosen both of those bolts, we can actually turn this rod with a pipe wrench, and that will adjust the distance. It'll actually make it go in more or out more, which will adjust the toe on the axle. A lot of times when you have an old tie rod assembly, the tie rods are still good, but you need to adjust it a little bit. And I'm going to show you a little trick to that. All right, so before I did that, I could not turn it at all. There it is. All right, we adjusted the tie rod just a little bit. Now it's right on 1/16 of an inch toe in. Yeah, so believe it or not, this truck is actually not off by very much. The front axle was actually already set. It was already pointing 1/2 inch to the left. The rear axle was pointing to the right, which is the right way, but it was pointed way too far. So at first I put a 1/16 of an inch shim. It moved it a little bit too much, so I took that one out and I put a 32nd of an inch shim, and now it's perfect. The toe was just a little bit too far towed in, so I tweaked that a little bit, but overall it doesn't take much, but those little adjustments make a big deal when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of miles going down the road.
Yeah. Well, and this truck has now had what we call a D service, which is we do it at 100,000 miles, so we change all the shocks. We replace the air dryer. So, you know, I've seen trucks come in with original shocks, you know, and these things we're told are good for about 60,000 miles. We change them at 100, and then, of course, you know, you always have cab shocks underneath, shocks on the steer. So for what's this truck got on it, Evan? 1.5? 1.4 million?
I think it's 1.4.
So 1.5 million mile truck. It pulls flatbed, obviously. One thing I was going to add about this truck is when Phil bought this truck, it actually had 4 axles. This truck started life as a prime truck pulling a van. Then somebody double framed it and put a 4th axle on it. And Phil said it was a handful to drive. They put an 18 speed in it and had super low gears. So when we brought it up here, Phil cut that back axle off of it and put 321 gears in it, which are not ideal. We're thinking about switching them out to 358s. If you get the driver to behave with the transmission, it doesn't matter, but right there he is, folks. So yeah.
Might have to be, because whenever I hit the bumps and stuff like that.
It would pull you.
Right, yeah, it would pull one side or the other way. So,
Now it's pretty good. It's
yeah, now it's pretty precise, which I'm thinking it might be the bushings. Most of it, maybe. I don't know. But
Well, the bushings were completely gutted. So
gone.
once
but it drives. It doesn't pull, rip anyway. It doesn't. Just kind of.
straight, yep.
next time you come through, we'll put the lasers back on it and check it.
Okay.
And
Everything will settle a little bit, being brand new parts. We'll just,
Okay.
It's here so many times, we'll just double check it.
Right, right.
but it should drive considerably better. All right, so what do you have? So this is the end of this week's video. We've got all this content on this truck pretty much done. We're going to dump the rear differential and the transmission, just do an oil change, and then starting tomorrow, we actually going to have parts for the International tomorrow. So hopefully we can get that thing out of here. And we're still waiting on a little bit of tooling to start on these engines. So that will do it for this week's video. We'll be back with you next Thursday, and hopefully you'll get to see an International get put back together and actually move under its own power. See you next time.